At 79, Diane Keaton didn't just leave behind movies and awards, she left behind a whole vibe of honesty, humor, and straight-up light. According to People, the legendary actress passed away in California on October 11, 2025, surrounded by a world that loved her realness just as much as her talent. And while tributes flooded in from everywhere, one name hit different: Al Pacino. For decades, their story stayed low-key behind Hollywood's blinding spotlight, a love that sparked on the set of The Godfather and never fully burned out. When the news reached him, the man known for keeping things locked inside finally broke his silence, and with just a few shaky words, dropped a truth that had been waiting half a lifetime to come out. This isn't just some fame and heartbreak story, it's about two souls who found something forever in a world that barely believes in it. If you believe real love never dies, drop a heart and hit subscribe, because what you're about to hear is one of Hollywood's most timeless love stories. But to really get those words, we've got to rewind to where it all actually started. Two souls, two worlds. Long before Hollywood ever whispered their names in the same breath, Al Pacino and Diane Keaton were living in totally different worlds that somehow taught them the same hard lesson: love can cut deep, but it can also heal. Pacino's world kicked off in the South Bronx, where hunger and chaos were just part of the daily grind. Born in 1940 to a working-class Sicilian family, he watched his father dip out before he could even remember his face. His mother, Rose, carried it all: provider, protector, everything, fighting to keep the heat on and hope alive. Al always said movies were the first place he ever felt safe, dark theaters where the glow of the screen felt warmer than a Bronx winter. He learned early that art could turn pain into survival. The kid who once traced frost on cracked windows would grow up teaching the world how silence could hit like an explosion. Meanwhile, across the country, Diane Keaton was born 6 years later under sunny California skies, a whole different scene from New York's gray grind. But inside her Los Angeles home, silence could weigh just as heavy as poverty. Her dad built bridges, her mom built dreams she never got to live. Dorothy Deanne Hall had once been crowned Mrs. Los Angeles 1955, but traded applause for housework, spotlight for the constant hum of a washing machine. Diane watched that quiet sacrifice every single day and made herself a promise: she would not fade into the background with a forced smile. Where Al's childhood was loud, sirens, shouting, neighbors arguing through paper-thin walls, Diane's was all restraint. No yelling, but no real talking either. "We didn't talk about feelings," she later wrote. "We lived inside them." That line could have been written for Pacino too, except his silence came in different forms: the pause before a fight, the breath held before the next hit. Both of them learned how to find beauty in what hurt. Pacino found it in flickering projectors, studying every move of actors who turned pain into poetry. Keaton found it on borrowed school stages, where she could finally speak without being shut down. When she played Blanche Dubois in A Streetcar Named Desire, her shaky voice didn't hide fear, it put the truth on blast. That role became her first real exit from the polite quiet of suburbia. By the time Al was roaming New York's freezing streets, hustling odd jobs and chasing acting classes he could barely pay for, Diane was stacking tips from waitressing, saving up for a one-way ticket east. Two lives moving toward the same city, powered by the same hunger, to be seen, for real. He brought fire, restless, raw, born from struggle. She brought light, awkward, radiant, shaped by restraint. Together, they'd eventually create a balance neither childhood ever gave them, his storm softened by her warmth, her gentleness grounded by his force. Both knew loneliness too well to confuse fame with love. Maybe that's why their bond felt bigger than any script. They clocked each other's wounds before either said a word. Their stories prove that greatness usually starts where comfort ends, in hunger that pushes an artist to keep breathing when the world turns cold, and in silence that teaches another how to speak with truth instead of perfection. Two opposite worlds, lining up two souls for a meeting that would rewrite everything. And when those wounds collided, something wild happened. 3. Al Pacino's early struggles, the boy who lived on hunger. Al Pacino's story didn't kick off with red carpets or standing ovations. It started with a hungry kid in a freezing apartment on the rough streets of the South Bronx. Born in 1940 to Sicilian parents, comfort wasn't part of the package. His father bounced early, and his mother, Rose, worked non-stop just to keep the lights on. Rent was always overdue, rooms were always cold, and nights were filled with sirens and shouting. But in the middle of all that noise, Al found something clutch, the movie theater. Under that flickering projector light, he felt warmth for the first time. The stories on screen gave meaning to the silence he carried inside. He saw faces bigger than life and realized emotion could speak louder than words. That moment changed everything. Acting wasn't a dream for Al, it was how he survived. By his teenage years, life had already hit hard. He worked any job he could to help his mom, hauling groceries, cleaning windows, whatever kept food on the table. Friends around him slipped into addiction, the kind that wipes out lives before they even start. 3 of them were gone before 20. Al could have followed, but he found a different way out, the stage. He trained at HB Studio in New York, where his raw intensity caught the eyes of mentors who saw past the rough edges and straight into something real. Acting didn't erase the pain, it flipped it into fuel. Every rejection, every freezing night crashing under streetlights, stacked onto the fire that would later define him. Those early years taught him how to endure. Some days he didn't eat. Some nights he slept in empty theaters, pretending he was just early for the next show. But every morning, he showed back up, driven by something poverty couldn't kill, belief in who he could become. Without acting, he later said softly, "I probably wouldn't have survived." Then came the break. In 1968, The Indian Wants the Bronx flipped the script. Critics were shook by his performance, not polished, but painfully real. That authenticity caught the attention of Francis Ford Coppola, who didn't just see an actor, but a storm packed into one man. Against studio pushback, Coppola rolled the dice and cast him as Michael Corleone in The Godfather. That film turned Al Pacino from a struggling actor into a straight-up legend. But behind the fame was still the same kid who once slept in the dark, hungry but undefeated. Every frame of The Godfather carried his past, the quiet of his childhood, the loneliness of survival, the fire that never went out. Fame didn't heal the wounds. It just muted them. He learned to speak through characters instead of words. Michael Corleone's stillness, Tony Montana's rage, Frank Slade's bruised pride, all pieces of Al, reshaped through art. He didn't know it yet, but his life of noise and struggle was about to crash into someone from the opposite world, a woman who built her strength out of silence. Name was Diane Keaton, and when they met, it wasn't just 2 actors crossing paths on a set. It was fire running straight into light, hunger bumping into grace. And when those 2 wounds collided, something wild, something extraordinary, went down. 4. Diane Keaton's early years, the girl who rewrote silence. While Al Pacino's life was shaped by hunger and chaos, Diane Keaton grew up inside quiet expectations. She was born on January 5, 1946, in Los Angeles, raised in a world full of sunshine, discipline, and a silence that felt way too heavy for a kid to carry. Her father, Jack Hall, was a civil engineer, steady, organized, reliable, and emotionally distant. Her mother, Dorothy Diane Hall, had once tasted the spotlight, crowned Mrs. Los Angeles 1955, but gave up that shine for domestic responsibility. Inside their neat, picture-perfect home, everything looked right: ironed clothes, dinner always on time, polite smiles locked in place. But underneath that calm surface, Diane felt an emptiness no one ever talked about. Her mother's unrealized dreams lingered in every corner of the house. "I watched my mother fade," Diane would later say. Her life became smaller and smaller, until there was nothing left but love and chores. That quiet heartbreak lit Diane's first spark of rebellion. She promised herself she wouldn't live life chasing someone else's dream. Her rebellion wasn't loud or messy, it was steady, thoughtful, and rooted in conviction. Teachers called her unpredictable, classmates said she was different. But that difference, that's where she found herself. If no one hears you, she once said, you have to become the echo yourself. By high school, Diane had already found the stage, a small, shaky light cutting through the silence. She performed A Streetcar Named Desire, and when the applause hit, it wasn't the noise she loved, it was the feeling of finally being seen. Acting didn't just give her a voice, it gave her freedom. At 20, she packed a single suitcase and left California for New York City, chasing the same dream that had once slipped through her mother's fingers. She dropped her last name Hall and took Keaton, her mother's maiden name, as both tribute and promise that she would carry the part of her mother who once dreamed big. New York was rough. Like, no joke. She lived in tiny apartments with paper-thin walls, weighted tables, and sang in smoky basements for tips. Some nights she couldn't afford dinner. Some mornings she walked miles to auditions that went absolutely nowhere. Still, even wiped out, she refused to quit. She wrote in her journal, "Fear is my fuel. I'll use it until it runs dry." Those long winters and uncertain mornings built the strength she'd later be known for, quiet, honest, unbreakable. She learned that gentleness wasn't weakness, and that sincerity could shine brighter than glamour. Years later, when fame finally caught up to her, she said, "I didn't chase perfection. I chased truth." That truth became her signature, the loud laugh, the unconventional clothes, the unfiltered honesty in an industry obsessed with masks. Her early years weren't glamorous, but they were sacred. Every rejection, every freezing night, every note of her mother's unfinished song settled into her spirit. She turned silence into a voice that would echo across generations. And while she was learning to speak through art, somewhere across the country, a young man was learning to survive through fire. Both broken in different ways, shaped by absence and longing. Fate, slow and patient, was lining them up for the moment their paths would finally cross. And when those two wounds met, something extraordinary happened. Quick pause, if you're still watching, you're clearly feeling this story. Tap the like button to honor Diane Keaton's legacy, and let YouTube know this story hits different. 5. The Godfather, Where Fire Met Light. It was 1971 when two young actors, both unknown to the world at large, stepped onto a dimly lit soundstage in New York. The air smelled like dust and old coffee, lights humming overhead, nobody realizing history was about to be made. Al Pacino was cast as Michael Corleone, the quiet son destined to become a king of shadows. Diane Keaton played Kay Adams, the woman who would love him and slowly lose him to power. What neither of them knew was that this film would be more than a masterpiece. It would mark the start of something deeply human, a connection blurring the line between fiction and real life. From the very first rehearsal, there was a spark no director could fake. Diane's warmth softened Al's guarded edges, his quiet intensity pulled her in. She teased him between takes, poking at that serious exterior, trying to make him laugh. He wasn't used to laughter, especially not hers, which hit like sunlight in a room with no windows. The crew noticed. Their chemistry wasn't practiced, it just was. It lived in the pauses between lines. When the cameras rolled, Michael looked at Kay with a tenderness that went way beyond the script. One cinematographer later said, "You could feel it, the whole room shifted when they looked at each other." After long days, they'd sit on the curb outside the studio, sharing sandwiches and stories. Diane talked about her mother's pageants and quiet heartbreak. Al talked about sleeping in theaters as a kid, dreaming of warmth. They weren't lovers yet, just two lonely souls recognizing something familiar in each other, that deep need to be understood. Then The Godfather blew up. Overnight, they went from struggling artists to icons. Magazine covers, glowing reviews, critics calling them the soul of modern cinema. But away from the hype, their bond stayed simple: burnt pasta dinners, late-night New York walks, inside jokes no one else got. Diane brought light into Ul's world, he gave her grounding. She later said, "He was mysterious and intense. I wanted to make him laugh." And he did, carefully, like laughter was something rare and earned. For the first time, Al Pacino let someone see the person behind the legend he was becoming. That's why The Godfather is more than just a film in their story. It was the crossroads of two lives shaped by opposite forces, his forged in fire, hers shaped by silence, finally finding balance. The storm met the calm. The flame met its reflection. As fame rose around them like a tide, their connection deepened quietly. Love wasn't just on the page anymore, it had stepped off the script and into real life. But in Hollywood, even the most sacred things don't stay hidden for long. And soon, the light that brought them together would start casting shadows neither could escape. 6. The hidden romance, love in the shadows of fame. As The Godfather became a global phenomenon, Al Pacino and Diane Keaton were suddenly caught in a spotlight they never asked for. Reporters chased them through airports, cameras flashing non-stop, magazine covers crowning them Hollywood's golden pair. Yet behind all that noise, their relationship stayed beautifully low-key: quiet dinners, late-night talks, a love that didn't need headlines to feel real. To the world, they were cinema legends. To each other, they were just Al and Diane, two restless, imperfect people who found peace together. When cameras shut off, their romance grew in private. Long walks through Central Park. Reading scripts out loud just to crack each other up. Diane slipped handwritten notes into his jacket pockets before shoots. Al, not big on words, left Polaroids on her pillow, small, intimate reminders he cared. Friends said the contrast somehow worked. Al, brooding and intense, carried every role like a weight. Diane, spontaneous and open, had a rare gift for pulling him out of himself. "He made me feel like I was part of something larger than life," she later said, "but I never wanted to lose the small stuff, the burnt pasta, the late-night drives, the jokes nobody else got." According to Newsweek, Diane Keaton even stepped in when Al Pacino was broke early in his career. After The Godfather hit, Al found out he was still drowning in debt and being mishandled by his lawyer. The article describes how Diane confronted the lawyer herself, demanding fair treatment and essentially saving Al from financial disaster. It wasn't flashy or dramatic, it was real loyalty. She saw his value before Hollywood did, and she stood up for him when he couldn't stand up for himself. Their love wasn't flashy or loud, it lived in the cracks between moments. In the small stuff. Like how she'd straighten his tie right before interviews, or how he'd lock eyes on her from across packed rooms, staring like he was trying to burn her image into his brain. Even when their careers started blowing up, they protected their privacy like it was glass. One wrong move and it'd shatter. To the outside world, they looked like the flawless on-screen dream couple. But off camera, they were just two people trying to keep something real alive in a life that no longer felt human at all. Al's whole universe revolved around work. He threw himself headfirst into roles that drained him dry: Serpico, Dog Day Afternoon, Scarface. Every character took a piece of him, and every time he came back, he was quieter, more distant, more closed off. Diane saw it before he ever did. She loved him hard, but she also knew she was loving a man who could disappear into his own silence for months at a time. Still, she stayed. "He had this fire that scared me and fascinated me at the same time," she once said. "You can't put out that kind of fire. You just learn how to live next to it." For Al, love felt like safety, but also like danger. He'd spent his whole life surviving loss, and now that he finally had something precious, he didn't trust himself not to lose it. His biggest fear wasn't fading fame, it was losing himself inside love. So he slowly pulled away, inch by inch, never realizing how deeply it cut her. And yet, there were moments of peace. Rare ones. Quiet nights with Sinatra humming in the background, Diane asleep on his chest, all whispering lines from plays he'd never perform. In those moments, words didn't matter. They just were, the storm and the calm, the fire and the light, vibing in silence. But fame is greedy. It wants everything: time, focus, sacrifice. And while the world clapped for them, the very thing that had pulled them together, the art they both loved, started pushing them apart. The love that once survived in the shadows was about to be tested under bright, unforgiving lights. 7. The distance that broke them. For almost 10 years, Al Pacino and Diane Keaton lived in a rhythm that somehow balanced fame with tenderness. Those quiet, in-between moments reminded them who they were before the world started watching their every move. But even a love that deep can buckle under distance. What began as two artists finding comfort in each other slowly turned into two lives drifting in opposite directions. By the late 1970s, they were both at the top of their game. Al was completely consumed, Bobby Duffield, and Justice for All, and the growing intensity that came with every new role. He vanished into characters that demanded all of him. Meanwhile, Diane was coming into her own, shining bright with Annie Hall and Reds. The time that once belonged to late-night talks and burned dinners was now swallowed by flights, film sets, and pure exhaustion. Diane, always wearing her heart on her sleeve, kept reaching out through letters, long, thoughtful notes that smelled faintly of her perfume. Sometimes he wrote back. Sometimes he didn't. Fame had a sneaky way of building invisible walls, and Al, who'd spent his whole life guarding himself, started hiding again behind work. He wasn't cruel. Just unreachable. She once said quietly, he'd go somewhere inside himself, and I never knew how to follow. For Al, love felt like a risk he didn't know how to manage. The deeper Diane leaned in, the more he feared losing his balance. He admired her strength, her laugh, her belief in love, but permanence scared him. She wanted marriage. He wanted space. Not because he didn't love her, but because he didn't know how to love without losing control of the life he'd fought so hard to build. Their ending wasn't dramatic. No explosions. No screaming matches. Just a slow unravel. Missed calls turned into missed weekends. Shared laughter faded into polite silence. Until one night, she packed her things, no anger, no tears, just acceptance. Standing in the doorway, she said, I can't keep waiting for you to want me completely. He didn't argue. He just stood there, watching her walk away, knowing he'd just let go of something he'd never replace. Years later, Al admitted, I wasn't ready for her love. She wanted a life, and I was still trying to survive mine. And Diane, with that grace only she had, said, he broke my heart, but he didn't mean to. Their breakup didn't explode into headlines, it just drifted into the silence between movie releases. But when the news finally spread, fans mourned like a great love story had ended too soon. One headline sighed, if Al and Diane couldn't make it, what hope do the rest of us have? Still, they never fully disappeared from each other's lives. When they crossed paths at events, something lingered, a glance held too long, a half-smile loaded with years of memories. They weren't together anymore, but they never truly let go either. For Diane, heartbreak turned into art. Her performances after the split carried a raw vulnerability, something only real loss could carve out. For Al, the silence she left behind showed up in his roles, the intensity, the restraint, the longing always sitting in his eyes. Their love didn't end in betrayal or bitterness. It ended the way real love often does, quietly, gently, because timing failed them. They were two souls meant for each other, just not forever. And even though the romance ended, the story didn't. What they shared followed them everywhere, through awards, roles, and the empty moments success could never fill. And even decades later, When the world thought their story was done, fate wasn't finished with them yet. 8. The roles that remembered. After their quiet separation, both Al Pacino and Diane Keaton carried the echoes of their love into everything they created. What they couldn't say out loud, they said through their work. It was like their souls kept meeting on screen long after their hearts took different paths. For Diane, the pain of letting go became the depth behind her most iconic roles. In Annie Hall, her laughter felt nervous but real, the pauses in her voice heavy with things left unsaid. Audiences saw a character, but those who knew her story saw truth, a woman who loved deeply and learned how to walk away without turning bitter. The performance won her an Oscar in 1978, yet even holding that golden statue, she later admitted she felt empty. Success came, but the man who once made her believe in herself was gone. Al poured himself into his work too. In Serpico and Scarface, his intensity felt raw, like someone still fighting ghosts no one else could see. The loneliness in his characters wasn't acting, it was lived. Friends noticed how he buried himself in roles, using them to release what he couldn't say. He once said, "Every character I play is a confession in disguise." Then, in 1990, fate pulled them back together on The Godfather Part 3. Nearly 20 years had passed. Diane was 44, Al was 50, and time had softened what once hurt like hell. Diane later admitted seeing him again brought everything back, not romantically, but in the most human way. "When I looked at him," she said, "it felt like no time had passed, and like all the time in the world had." On set, the old rhythm came back. Between takes, they laughed the same way they had in the 70s. But there was a new silence now, gentler, wiser, full of what ifs. The camera caught something real again. When Kay looked at Michael with quiet heartbreak, it wasn't acting. It was Diane looking at the man who had once been her forever. When filming wrapped, they went their separate ways again, this time without regret. What they shared didn't need labels anymore. It had evolved into something rare, mutual reverence. They weren't lovers, but they were forever stitched into each other's stories. In later interviews, they spoke with warmth instead of pain. Diane said, "I loved him deeply. I still do, just differently." And Al, in his quiet way, admitted, "She was the one that got away, and I let her." Their connection outlived the romance. It became legend, a reminder that love doesn't have to last forever to be real. Their chemistry, on screen and off, became Hollywood myth. Directors talked about it, co-stars admired it, and fans never stopped believing that somewhere beneath it all, their love still lived, like a beautiful ghost haunting every frame they shared. They loved each other the way only artists can, fully, fiercely, imperfectly. And even as the world moved on, every film they made carried a trace of who they once were. Because real love, when it's lived real and honest, never really fades out. It doesn't vanish, it just switches lanes. It finds new ways to stay alive, in memories, in art, in moments, and in the stories we keep telling so it never truly dies. Quick reminder real quick, before we keep rolling, smash that subscribe button so you don't miss the next chapter in Hollywood's most unforgettable love stories. 9. Mutual reverence, love without form. As time moved on, Al Pacino and Diane Keaton stopped stressing over labels or trying to explain what they were to each other. What once burned hot and loud had mellowed into something softer, quieter, a wordless connection that survived time, distance, and changing lives. It wasn't about holding tight anymore, it was about getting it. According to People magazine, Al Pacino and Diane Keaton first crossed paths on the set of The Godfather in the early 1970s. That on-screen spark didn't stay fictional for long, it turned into a real-life romance. People reported that their relationship went back and forth for years, shaped by packed schedules and totally different life plans, but the love between them never really disappeared. Even after they went their separate ways, the magazine noted that Diane often spoke about Al with warmth, calling him a brilliant, complicated man, while Ol later admitted she was the one that got away. In interviews, both of them spoke with the same mix of love and sadness, like two people who shared something too rare to ever fully put into words. Diane, always open and heartfelt, never stopped admiring him. "I adored him then, and I adore him now," she once said. "He's unlike anyone I've ever known." Ol, a man who spent most of his life dodging emotional talk, shocked everyone when he finally confessed, "She was the one that got away, and I let her." There was no anger in his voice, just calm acceptance, the kind that only comes when you love someone enough to let them walk their own path. Their friendship lasted through decades of change, through award seasons, aging spotlights, and shifting times. They still checked in on each other now and then, sometimes about work, sometimes about absolutely nothing. Whenever Diane was asked who her favorite co-star was, she'd smile first, then say, "Ol." Always Ol. And every time someone mentioned her name to him, Ol would light up, like time itself couldn't touch the memory of her laugh. They became symbols of a different kind of love, the kind that doesn't need ownership to be real. What they shared wasn't tragic, it was proof. Proof that love can change shape without disappearing. It lives on in the silence between words, in the space where two souls once met and learned something about themselves. In Hollywood, where relationships often disappear faster than fame, theirs turned into a quiet legend. People still talked about their chemistry with awe, like it belonged to something bigger than just two actors, like the universe itself had a hand in it. They became living proof that love can survive endings, evolving into respect, reverence, and a connection that never fully breaks. By the time they both reached their 70s, they had lived full lives, separate, yet forever linked. Diane kept acting and writing, her warmth still filling every room she entered. Ol kept working too, his performances still carrying the same raw honesty that once pulled her in. And even though they never found their way back as lovers, their bond stayed sacred, like a thin gold thread quietly woven through both of their stories. There's a special kind of peace that comes from knowing you were loved deeply, even if it couldn't last forever. That peace shaped them both. Because what Ol and Diane shared was never about forever, it was about truth. And sometimes, truth lasts longer than any promise ever could. 10. The Farewell, October 2025. On the morning of October 11th, 2025, the world woke up to a headline that didn't feel real. According to People, Diane Keaton had passed away in California at the age of 79. Her family shared no additional details, asking only for privacy, a final, graceful boundary from a woman who had spent her life giving so much of herself to the world. The news spread slowly, like a heavy wave across Hollywood. Within hours, social media filled with tributes from actors, directors, and fans who had grown up with her laughter. Meryl Streep wrote, "She taught us that truth could be funny, and that strength could be gentle." Emma Stone called her, "the reason awkward girls everywhere found confidence." Film sets paused, talk shows dimmed their lights, and even Broadway theaters in New York observed a minute of silence. It felt like the entertainment world itself stopped to breathe. But among all the tributes, one silence spoke louder than the rest, Al Pacino's. For 2 full days, he said nothing. Friends close to him told reporters he stayed inside his New York apartment, standing by the window overlooking the river, watching the early morning light reflect back at him. The voice that had defined decades of cinema suddenly had no words left. When he finally spoke, it wasn't through an interview or a press conference. It came as a short, shaky statement, soft, almost like a whisper in the chaos. "She was my friend, my light, and a part of me that time could never take. I will love her always." The statement was brief, but for those who knew their story, it carried an entire lifetime, the laughter, the heartbreak, the quiet moments, the years. It wasn't just goodbye. It was a confession that took 50 years to say out loud. That evening, as the sun dipped low, fans gathered outside the TCL Chinese Theater in Los Angeles. They brought flowers, handwritten notes, and old photos from Annie Hall and The Godfather. Someone placed a wide-brimmed hat, her signature look, next to a candle. The flame flickered once, then held steady, like it refused to fade. Across the world, tributes lit up screens in Rome, London, and Paris. One headline called her a timeless muse. Another named her Hollywood's heart in human form. But one of the most touching tributes didn't come from a studio or a celebrity. It came from a small art house cinema in the Bronx, the same borough where Al Pacino grew up. They projected Annie Hall onto a white brick wall, free for anyone who wanted to watch. Dozens showed up, sitting in folding chairs, laughing and crying together in the cool October night. For Al, the loss was deeply personal, impossible to explain. He skipped public memorials, but friends later shared that he rewatched The Godfather alone, not as a movie, but as memory. Every scene carried new weight now, the looks, the pauses, the tenderness that was never written into the script. People around him described his grief as quiet, almost spiritual. He didn't cry loudly, one longtime friend said. He just kept saying she was light, that everything she touched became brighter. Diane Keaton once said, "Love doesn't always last, but it always leaves something behind." And as her image faded from the big screen one last time, those words finally clicked. What she left behind wasn't just unforgettable performances, it was a legacy of warmth, honesty, and the courage to be beautifully imperfect. Her laughter straight up changed how people looked at women in Hollywood. Her honesty took the sharp edges off fame and made it feel real, not fake or glossy. And tucked away in a quiet corner of Al Pacino's life, she left something nobody else ever could, a memory that would never fade, never lose its shine. That October, as film reels started spinning again, and the world tried to keep it moving, one thing stayed crystal clear. Diane Keaton didn't just live under the spotlight, she lit it up. And even though her story had reached its final page, the glow she left behind. Yeah, that was forever. 11. Al Pacino speaks at last. In the days after Diane Keaton passed, Al Pacino became the definition of quiet heartbreak. Hollywood was loud, tributes everywhere, interviews non-stop, memorial specials rolling back to back, but Al stayed still, untouched by all the noise. For decades, he played men who buried pain behind silence, but this time there was no acting involved. This silence was the real deal. When he finally spoke, it wasn't with some dramatic press release, or a long emotional sit-down like people expected. Nope. It came as a short, handwritten note shared through his publicist. "She was my friend, my light, and a part of me that time could never take. I will love her always." Simple words. Heavy meaning. For anyone who knew their story, it felt like the final chapter, soft, honest, and loaded with decades of things never said out loud. It was like every feeling he'd packed away since the 1970s hit the surface all at once, squeezed into one shaky sentence. Friends said Al dodged interviews and public appearances for weeks. He stayed in his apartment, where sunlight poured through tall windows on two shelves lined with framed photos. One of them was Diane, smiling, wide-brimmed hat tilted just right, eyes full of mischief. He kept that photo near his piano. Every time he walked by, he'd stop, rest his hand on the frame, and just breathe for a second. A close friend told The Hollywood Reporter, he didn't say much. But when he did, it was always about her. About how she made everything feel lighter, how she found beauty in flaws. That month, he rewatched the Godfather trilogy. Not for nostalgia. Not for legacy. Just to feel close to her again. Those quiet scenes between Michael and Kay, once just parts of a role, suddenly felt sacred, like pieces of a life they lived off-screen. When Michael looked at Kay with regret, it wasn't acting anymore. It was memory. People who worked with both of them talked about their bond with real reverence. Warren Beatty said, "They didn't just act together, they got each other." Meryl Streep added, "You could see it. They didn't need words." And maybe that's why Ul's short statement hit so hard. It wasn't about grief in the usual way. It was about a love that never really ended, a love that just learned how to live quietly, waiting for one last goodbye. Later, when a journalist asked if he had any regrets, Ul paused for a long moment. His voice cracked a little, soft but steady. "I think love changes, but it never leaves. She still is." That moment became one of the most replayed clips of his entire career, not because of who he was as an actor, but because of who he showed himself to be as a man. Vulnerable. Grateful. Brave enough to speak softly in a world that's always yelling. In just a few words, Al Pacino reminded everyone of something Diane had always believed: love matters, even when it's unfinished. And even after the cameras moved on, one truth stayed solid: their story never really ended. It just shifted from the screen to the quiet space between memory and silence, where two souls who once burned bright now rested in peace. Because when love is real, it doesn't die. It just finds a quieter place to live. 12. Closing reflection: the love that became eternal. When everything finally went quiet, after the tributes faded and the screen stopped replaying her laughter, something powerful lingered. A stillness that felt almost sacred. Not the silence of grief, but the calm that follows truth. Diane Keaton and Al Pacino were never a fairy tale. They were something way more real, and way more lasting. Diane once said, "Love doesn't always last, but it always leaves something behind." And she nailed it. What she and Al shared proved that some connections are just too deep to end. Their bond wasn't built on marriage or time, it was built on understanding, on two souls who lived, lost, and figured out how to keep loving in their own low-key way. For Al, that love became part of his craft, the softness behind the fire, the calm under the chaos. For Diane, it lived in every line she delivered, every laugh that filled the space between words. Together, they turned love into something unbreakable: legacy. After her death, fans went back to their films. Annie Hall, The Godfather, Reds, looking for Mr. Goodbar. But this time, they weren't just watching movies, they were watching memories. In every look, every pause between Michael and Kay, there was something deeper than acting. Love, frozen in time, still glowing. At 85, Al Pacino kept working, his passion still strong, but friends said he'd changed. He was softer now. More patient. More reflective, especially when her name came up. One night, while promoting a new project, a reporter asked what love really meant after all these years. He smiled just a little and said, "It's what stays after everything else fades." The people who followed their story understood. That was Diane. That was them. Their love was never about forever. It was about truth, the kind that doesn't need to be loud to be real. It lived in shared looks across crowded sets, in the way she could make him laugh like nobody else, and in how he still carried her with him decades later. Hollywood will remember them as legends. But if you look closer, you'll see something rarer: two people who found light in each other, and refused to let the world take it away. Their story wasn't about tragedy. It was about transformation. From passion to friendship. From youth to memory. From heartbreak to peace. As the credits of their lives keep rolling, one truth shines through: some loves aren't meant to be lived forever, they are meant to be felt forever. And that's what makes theirs eternal. So as the world says goodbye to Diane Keaton, it doesn't just mourn an actress. It honors a spirit, one who turned imperfection into beauty and silence into art. And somewhere, Al Pacino still carries her laughter, still feels her light in the pauses between his words. Because real love never dies. It just changes shape, from touch to memory, from memory to legend, from legend to light. And that light, the one Diane left behind, is still burning. Softly. Endlessly. In every heart she ever touched. Tell us in the comments, What's your favorite Diane Keaton moment or film? Drop a heart if you believe true love never fades. Subscribe for more stories that dig into the untold truths behind Hollywood's most unforgettable legends. Because some lights, like Diane's, never go out. Yellow heart,